Hi, forensic friends. Today I thought I would lend my own voice to some of the videos you've been watching and go over with you some of the key ideas behind the development of a biological profile, which is one of those main areas that the forensic anthropologist may be called upon to determine when it comes to finding of remains or bones. So our objectives for this video are to take a look at what the proper and common names are for a lot of the bones that are most relevant forensically. We're going to try to determine the sex from both pelvis and the skull. Right? We're going to talk about the different features that would be used to determine the age, the stature, and a little bit about the ancestry of the skeleton or remains that are found. So here's some of the vocabulary that we'll need throughout this lecture, and you can stop the video now, look up anything you need to, and you should also have your OneNote page with your skeleton and the pelvis and the skull diagrams up, and you can check those as we go through this lecture. I'll be talking about each of the parts that I asked you to identify in that on that worksheet. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about forensic anthropology in general. You've been reading a lot, introducing you to the field and some of the things that forensic anthropologists do. And their primary concern is generally the identification of remains. And then also secondarily to that is how the person died. Prior to determining what the person's identity was and how they died, they might be called onto a scene to determine if a finding is actually bones or not. Certainly older bones can look a lot like rock, so it can be difficult to tell the difference. And they'll also be asked to determine whether or not the bones are human. Once the bones have been identified as human, then you can get to work taking a look at the bones, determining what condition they're in, start taking measurements from them, and start getting information from them as far as identification of the person of the remains. So in addition to taking a look at the remains, which we would consider a gross examination, we also have more technologically sophisticated methods these days that will allow us to identify the remains with much more certainty. If available, we could, of course, do a DNA analysis. Of course, DNA has its own drawbacks. You need to have someone to compare it to. Otherwise, you just have a DNA profile, and there's no code in the DNA profile that tells you what the person's name was or where they came from or anything like that. So DNA requires a reference to compare it to. We might also come across an instance where someone has had some surgical replacements, so knees or hips or shoulders, anything like that would have a serial number on it. If they have a pacemaker implanted, it would have a serial number on it. And we could use those serial numbers to also determine a person's identity with much more certainty. But for today, we're going to focus on the bones, right? Reading the bones. So before we begin to read the bones, it's a good idea to understand what a bone is and what it does. And the bones, it's helpful to think of bones like the frames of houses. So they provide structure for our bodies, right? They also provide spots where our muscles can attach, and they provide the structure for our muscles to move. And also, bones protect our organs, right? So again, it's just like the frame of a house. It provides us with structure. It allows us anchor points for other parts that we need to function, like our muscles, and it also provides protection, particularly for the upper thoracic organs like the heart and the lungs, and then in the pelvis as well, like the reproductive organs that we have. By reading the bones, so to speak, we hope to develop what's called a biological profile. The biological profile is going to, or we're going to start that biological profile by looking at what the sex of the person was. And just a minute to speak to the difference between sex and gender, right? Sex is a biological distinction, and that's what the bones will tell us, versus one's gender identity, which of course can be self-determined. We'll also take a look at how we can determine what age the person was when they died. And that's interesting because I hope that didn't get confusing. But there's two questions that forensic anthropologists have to answer that deal with age. And one of them is the age of the bones, and the other one is the age of the person when they died. So when we talk about the age of the bones, what we're really talking about there is how long the bones have been, in the situation that they're in, buried or whatever the case may be. So you could have a person who was 16 when they died and their bones are 100 years old, right? Because they may have been buried 100 years ago, but they were 16 when they died. So we have the age of the bones, and then we have the age of the person when they actually died. We'll also take a look at how we can tell a person's height or stature from their bones. And we're doing that in the lab, you guys are starting now. And a little bit about how we determine ancestry by looking at skulls. Also, the details of a person's health and the lifestyle they may have lived in life. And lastly, we would also want to know about any trauma that this person had done to their bones, either perimortem or antemortem or postmortem trauma as well. And I'm going to leave that for another video. So we're not going to cover that in this video, but it is part of the biological profile that we would be interested in. So we're going to start off with determining the sex of an individual. So there's some stereotypical characteristics when you're looking at an entire skeleton that might help you determine whether the skeleton you're looking at is male or female. And again, these are very stereotypical. And the one interesting thing to remember with all of this information is that people's bodies vary greatly. So every time we are talking about a skull or a pelvis or something like that, we're sort of talking about the average of a male and the average of a female. And there can be great variation from person to person that could easily make a female's skull look more like a male's or their forearm or anything like that. So all of this stuff is stereotypical or very average male versus female distinction. So for example, the overall appearance of the skeleton tends to be more slender for a female than it is for a male. And again, we're talking about a very average female versus a very average male. We also tend to see more muscular development in males. And even though we're looking at the bones, we can tell about the muscles. And you guys saw that in the Sterling Man video. The bones react to the development of the muscles. So someone who is particularly robust in their arm and chest muscles will see their bones become more robust in order to better serve the muscles. So bigger muscles means bigger bones. You can change that throughout your life. So if you suddenly decided tomorrow you wanted to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger from the 80s, your bones would actually grow in order to accommodate the attachment of the bones as you grew your muscles. It's also important to note that looking at skeletal remains and determining sex is much more difficult if the person is a child. All right, so if the remains in question are not of a person who has at least reached puberty, it's much more difficult to tell the sex because most of the changes that take place between the male and female skeletons do so through puberty. So if a person has not passed puberty yet, it can be difficult to determine male versus female. So the main bone we're going to look at, and if you asked a forensic anthropologist if they had just one bone to pick to tell you about a person, they would want the pelvis. The pelvis, or what most people think of as the hip bones, are really the most reliable way to determine the sex of an adult skeleton because there are great differences between male and female pelvises, starting with the size and the shape of the pelvic cavity. So here we see a male pelvis, and you can see highlighted in purple here is the pelvic cavity or the opening that forms in the middle of the pelvis. Typically, we would describe the male opening to be somewhat of a heart shape, and you can contrast this to the female opening, which you can see is much more oval, kind of a flattened oval shape, and is also much larger. And just overall, you can see that the male hips tend to be slimmer than the female hips tend to be. And there's a good reason that the female hips are wider and that the pelvic opening is wider. And that, of course, is because of babies. The female pelvis needs to have enough room for the babies to emerge, right? And you can see in this video here how the head has to come through the pelvis. You'll even see in just a moment in the upper right view that the head will actually push down on the tailbone or the coccyx a little bit. So there's some flexibility in the coccyx of the female that we don't generally see in the male. So again, you can see that is why the female pelvis is different than the males in terms of the opening. And as I mentioned before, if we take a look at the coccyx or tailbone, this part right down here, it has more cartilage in the female so that it's a little bit more flexible during childbirth. Some other differences you can see here is that the overall sacrum, the sacrum is the last 5 vertebra, is wider and shorter in the female than it is in the male. Again, all of these are to accommodate a baby going through. And we also have the subpubic arch, which is right at the bottom there. And you can see in a male that the angle of that arch is smaller. So typically between 60 and 70 degrees versus on a female where it's between 90 and greater up to 100 degrees. This part right in the middle here that's in blue on both of these pelvises is what's called the pubic symphysis. And that's a great area to look at for age as well. So we'll talk about that again in a little while. Okay, so the other area we would want to look at to determine the difference in sex between the male and the female pelvis is from a lateral or side view. So this is the ilium or hip bone from the side view. And what we can focus in on here is what's called the sciatic notch, the greater sciatic notch. And you can see once again on the males, it's a much narrower curve or archway, and on the females, it's a much wider archway. Also, we can see a flatter and wider ilium or hip bone for the female versus the male. Now, most forensic anthropologists over years of experience will become very skilled at just looking at a pelvis and being able to tell immediately if they are male or female. But they always will have references to go back to because not all males and females are going to be stereotypically male or female. And I have this slide to show you some of the differences in males and females just based on height. So you can see the difference between a shorter female and a taller female, and the difference in the shape of the pelvic opening, right? The shape of the sciatic notch that's down here is different, and yet these are both females, right? And you can see the same thing on males as well. So forensic anthropologists are always going to use a set of standard references for pelvises, for skulls, for all of the bones that they examine in order to help them determine which bone is most like the one that they are examining from the case at hand. So if you want, you can pause the video here and just take a look at the overall differences that we discussed, and it's a good reference to come back to later. Another way we can determine the sex of a skeleton is by looking at the skull. And here we have, again, 2 skulls, male on the left and female on the right. So some of the prominent features that distinguish the two would be the brow ridge. So the brow ridge, you could feel this on your own head, is a little bump part that comes out, and it's right around where your eyebrow is. So it's not where your eye is, it's right above it on your skull, a little brow ridge. And it's typically more prominent in males than it is in females. We also see the orbital opening or the eye socket tends to be more square or rectangular in a male than in a female, where we generally see it being more oval shaped. We can also see the zygomatic arch, which is the cheekbone, and that tends to, again, be more prominent in males. It tends to stick out past the top of the cranium for males, and for females, it tends to lie closer to the sides of the face. Lastly, we have the mandible or the jaw. And in males, again, that tends to be more stereotypically masculine, meaning that it has more of a square appearance to it, whereas the female jaw tends to have more of a rounded appearance to it. And again, all of these things are stereotypical, and you can, of course, have women with square jaws and men with round jaws, and so on and so forth. But if we're looking at a typical skull for male versus female, these are the aspects that we would be focused on. From the side, the lateral view, we can see that the frontal bone there has more of an angle for the females, so it's more sloping backward on a male, and it's more upright on the female. We can also see something called the occipital protuberance. So your occipital bone is the one that's in the back of your skull. And on males, there tends to be a bit more prominent a bump right at the bottom. And that's where your muscles attach to your skull. And so again, you can go ahead and reach back on your own head and see if you could feel for that little bump that you have in the back of your head. Tends to be bigger on males than on females, as is the general rule of thumb, right, for all of these things. The other one we look at is something called the mastoid process. So the mastoid process is that little piece of bone you can see here from the side, and this is where your jaw muscles connect to your skull. And once again, you will find that they tend to be more prominent in males than they are in females. Also, the angle of the jaw, again, in males tends to be closer to 90 degrees, more of square, and with females tends to be a larger angle, more gracile. This is, again, another good spot for you to pause the video and take a look at all of the overall characteristics that we just discussed. So now let's move on to age. Let's talk about age. So in order to determine a skeleton's age, there are several different types of bones and several different ways we can determine that. First off, knowing how many bones a person has is important, obviously. And it's also interesting to note that when babies are born, they have more bones than an adult would. So when a baby is born, they have over 270 bones. I've actually seen sources that list the number of bones for babies at 400. So it depends on how you're counting. But let's just say they have at least 270 bones at birth. By the time you become an adult, you only have 206 bones. So what's happening to the bones? Where are they going? How are they disappearing? They don't exactly disappear. What happens is the bones actually form together. They go from being 2 or 3 bones to being 1 bone as you grow in a process called ossification, where the bones join together. And some of your bones don't finish ossifying until you're over 50 years old. So it's actually a process that takes place over the majority of a lifetime. One great way we can determine if a skeleton is a juvenile or an adult is to take a look at some of the long bones and see if the growth plates are still there. So if we take a look at the x-ray on the right, this is a juvenile female. And if we look at the different components of her femur bone, we can see, first of all, the shaft of the bone, which technically is called the diaphysis. We can also see each end of the bone, which is called the epiphysis. And what you can notice in this x-ray specifically are the spaces that go between the ends of the bones, the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And these are called the epiphyseal plates, or basically just the growth plates. So in this area, you're going to have cartilage, and that cartilage is going to be taken over or replaced by bone as you grow. You could see that in this set of bones here, which clearly demonstrates the distinction between the epiphysis of the bone in the younger or more juvenile bone, and then how that epiphysis, that line of growth, actually disappears as the person or ages or gets older. Another area that we can see this occur is with your vertebrae. So your vertebrae, of course, are the bones that make up your spine, and there's 24 bones, each one called a vertebrae. If we look at them when you're born, you can see they're very distinct 3 bones. And as you grow as a child, 2 of the bones start to fuse together. And then as you, again, approach puberty, those 2 bones begin to fuse to the vertebral column until you eventually become fully grown, and you can see the changes that occur in the vertebrae during that time. Another way we can tell age is through teeth. So, of course, teeth develop at different times. Again, you can see the baby teeth starting to come out here. And then as a child ages, you could see the grown-up teeth or adult teeth coming up behind, pushing out the baby teeth. And we'll notice that a tooth is going to come in right back here, and that's going to be the last set of teeth that come in, the wisdom teeth. And so they're going to come in a person's early 20s. And the presence of certain teeth to try to determine the age of a person. And of course, it's all a little bit variable, again, from person to person, but it's a good marker for a person's age, particularly if we can see whether or not their wisdom teeth have erupted. We can tell what age they are based on that. So if a person already has all their wisdom teeth, we're going to have to look at some of the other bones in order to give us a better idea of a person's age. And one place we can look back to is the skull. The skull has sutures or openings in it. And again, that's to help us get through the birth canal easily, to give a little wiggle room to the skull. And as a person ages, those openings begin to close. So if we look at a typical 20-year-old skull, we could still see a pretty defined line between two of the plates that we have. As that person ages, so we take a look at them at 35 years of age, we can see that those sutures are starting to literally do what the definition is. They're starting to stitch together. By the time they become 50, a lot of the bone has smoothed out. There's still only a little bit of indication that the sutures were even there at all. And by the time that person reaches 70, there's basically no indication that the sutures were there. So again, your bones are constantly growing and remodeling throughout your lifetime, and changes can occur that the forensic anthropologist can use to try to determine a person's age. Another area we might look would be the ribs. So your ribs are connected to your sternum or your breastbone with cartilage, but over time, that cartilage gets replaced with bone. So again, if we look at a 20-year-old, we can see here a lot of spongy cartilage. As that person ages, that cartilage begins to deteriorate and the bone takes over. By the time they're 50, very little cartilage left, mostly bone. And by the time the person is 75, we can see the cartilage connecting them is pretty much gone, and it has all now fused into bone. Another area to go back to would be the pelvis. And the pelvis has a particular area, as I mentioned earlier, called the pubic symphysis. And the pubic symphysis is that area right in the middle of the pelvis. And when you look at it in a young adult, it looks very modeled, right? It has a lot of pitting in it, a lot of ridges and furrows. And what we're going to see over time is that those little ridges and dents and furrows begin to, again, they begin to smooth out, and the pubic symphysis itself begins to thin out. And so you could see that by the time the person is, again, 75, it's become shrunken, thinner. Now, another thing we can look at are some of the pathologies that people develop as they age. So, for example, a person who has osteoporosis, if we examine their bones, we might be able to determine the level of osteoporosis that they have, which would help us to determine their age. You could see, starting on the left, what a healthy bone looks like, that spongy bone on the inside, very tightly packed. And as we move toward the right, you can see that spongy bone getting less and less dense and more air pockets forming. That is going to cause the bones to become weaker or more brittle as they age. Not everybody gets osteoporosis, but it is a good indication if a person is older if they have this. The other thing we might look at is arthritis. And again, not everyone gets arthritis, and there are certainly juveniles who have arthritis as well, but it is a typical aging disease. So we can look at a normal hand on the left, and on the right, you could see one that has arthritis. So there's erosion of the bones get displaced. There's inflammation around all of the joints that we see there. So again, that can help us determine a person's age. We might also use this to help determine how they used their bones. People who undergo repetitive motions over and over again due to their occupation or a hobby may develop arthritis in particular joints, which can help us determine those occupations or hobbies. So again, a nice little chart here that you can pause on or come back to for the overall markers of age. And now let's move on to stature. So stature meaning height. How do we tell how tall a person was from their bones? And particularly if we don't have all of their bones. Because if we have the complete skeleton, it's actually relatively simple, as you might imagine, to simply lay the skeleton out, put all the bones in their proper places and then measure the skeleton. But if we don't have the full skeleton, the best thing that we can use are some of the long bones. The long bones being the bones of your arms and the bones of your legs. And we would use a device called an osteometric board, which is basically like when you were a kid and you were trying to figure out what your shoe size was. You would go to the shoe store and put your foot down, and they had this sliding thing at the top, right? That would tell you wherever it landed was where your shoe size was. So this is the same thing here. This is an easy way to measure a bone. You put the bone in and slide this part down, and then you can just read the measurement right there for the length of the bone. As we're going to be doing in the lab, you're going to see that we can take different bones and use some formulas to determine what the height of a person was. And those formulas are based on a person's sex and their ancestry. So there's a lot of different formulas you can use. We're going to simplify it and just use one formula. But if you knew the person's ancestry, you would be able to narrow that down to a more precise formula. This is just an example of some of the formulas that you can use based on the bone that you have, and again, whether you're male or female and what your ancestry is. And there's a number of these based on, again, sex and ancestry. They're all based on statistical databases, measuring people's bones of known ancestry and known sex, and then entering them into the database and statistically determining what the formula should be. So that does bring us to the idea of ancestry. I've mentioned it a couple times already. Ancestry, or a person's origins, can be the most difficult thing to determine, particularly in our society, where we are the melting pot and people of different races and ethnicities and ancestries have procreated and have children now who have mixed ancestry. So it can be difficult to determine what a person's true ancestry was unless they come from a race that is more isolated or has remained throughout their family marrying within their same race or ancestry. So technology is beginning to help us with that. And the same way that we can create databases of heights, they're starting to create databases of skulls. The skull is the best bone to use in order to determine a person's ancestry. There are specific ancestral differences in the skull that can be determined, and it's helpful if you have a database of known ethnicities. And what can happen now is you can actually scan your skull and then compare it to the database, just like you would a fingerprint, and see which of the skulls is the closest match to the skull that you have in your case. So that can help you determine what the ancestry is of the person. So again, there are some general ideas for the general groupings of European, African, and Asian, and that's what you're seeing on the screen now. But I'm not really going to ask you to determine ancestry because, again, in actual cases with real skulls, this can be very difficult. The differences are very small, and you would need to do a lot of measuring in order to understand that, or to scan it, like I said, and put it into a computer and measure differences in the nasal openings and the eye sockets and things like that. So we are going to understand this theoretically, but I am not going to ask you to do this from a practical point of view. Now, one way that ancestry really helps is in the idea of reconstruction, facial reconstruction. So if we know markers for different ancestries, like we know thickness of the skin or the cheeks or the jawline for different ancestries, and we can determine what the ancestry is of a skull, we can attempt to reconstruct what the person's face looked like. So here at the top, you can see an artist's rendering. So this is a pure drawing of this person, what he might have looked like. And in the next slide, you can see a second example of using clay. So a sculptor would come in, and again, here you can see all of those little markers that I spoke of, all these little dowels sticking out from the person's face. All of them indicate the depth of the flesh and the muscle that should be applied to the face in order to approximate what the person's face actually looked like. And nowadays, as you saw this in the Sterling Man video, we're doing this in the computer mostly. So the computer database can draw on its statistics for all of the different markers of muscle and tissue, apply them to the skeleton, and then apply the muscles, apply the skin, and even give us some coloring to it. You're going to watch a video on this process, specifically on someone who used the clay, an artist who used the clay to do this, and how they actually caught a killer based on the reconstruction of his face. The other thing we want to remember about bones is that bones can tell us a person's story. They can be like a diary for a person over their lifetime. They will give us indications of any injuries that the person has sustained. They could possibly tell us diseases that they have gone through. They could tell us how they use their body, if they had a particular occupation that made them more developed in the upper body or the lower body or the right side or the left side. And we can also use their bones to tell us what they ate and how they ate, basically, if they were well nourished or malnourished. You again saw that in the Sterling Man video, where you could do a chemical composition analysis of the bones and try to determine what are some of the things that these people ate. So looking for injuries, looking for diseases, looking for signs of their use, and of course, again, signs of issues in their diet or diseases that they might have had in the past. The last part of information we want to get from the skeleton is whether or not it's undergone any trauma. And by trauma, we mean damage to the bones. We want to try to determine if that damage occurred ante-mortem while the person was living, peri-mortem at approximately the time of their death, or post-mortem after the person has died. So we'll take a look at some of the different ways bones can display injuries depending on when those injuries occurred. We'll also take a look at some specific injuries that are likely to cause death, such as bludgeoning, gunshot wounds, and strangulation. And we'll see how they manifest themselves in the bones. That's coming up next time.